Saffron, over to yourself.
Thanks so much. Just a little correction, I'm Deputy Chief Executive, but that's fine. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today and for having me here. I'm really delighted. What I'm going to do today is just take a bit of a tour d'horizon around some of the workforce issues that we know are out there, which are the long-term plan is an important framer for our aspirations, but we know that there are some big challenges in workforce that we need to tackle if we are going to deliver on all of our aspirations for the NHS, for its patients and the public. We know that there is a need for long-term workforce planning across the NHS. This was formalised to a certain extent in the legislation, the Health and Social Care Act of last year, but little has been delivered yet. Everyone says it's imminent, but imminent has gone on for an incredibly long time. The most imminent, I think, that I've ever seen something. Apparently it is coming very, very soon, but it was last November and last March as well. So what I'm going to look at today is some of the politics, the pressures and the performance across the NHS and the role that workforce plays in that. Before I do, I just wanted to say a little bit about NHS providers in case you don't know who we are. So NHS Providers is the membership organisation and representative body for England's NHS trusts and foundation trusts, and we've got 100% of trusts in voluntary membership, and we cover all types of trusts. So we're not just out there talking on behalf of hospitals, it's also mental health, community services, ambulance services and specialist trusts, so the whole gamut, and obviously trusts across the whole country. And our member organisations employ 1.4 million staff, have a combined turnover of 104 billion and critically provide care free at the point of use for 56 million people. So that's the sector that NHS Providers represents. So just going to move on now, and I framed this presentation around the politics, the pressures and the performance, and all of those issues pivot around workforce. And we've got this huge political febrility out there at the moment. Obviously, we are in, well, you can either see it as being in the downward slope to a general election, depending on your point of view, or we're ramping up for a general election. But however you look at it, general election is coming in the next 18 months. This adds a high degree of short-termism into everybody's thinking, and it puts a massive brake on decision-making, apart from those really short-term decisions that might serve the purposes of a general election. And that's not just about the party of government, that's also about the opposition lending its support or otherwise to proposals, because they're going to be looking also at, what needs to get them over the line in a general election. So, we've got a whole host of missions and pledges out there from politicians at the moment. We know the governments, they're out there talking continuously about waiting lists, cutting NHS waiting lists. We all know what sits behind that. It's a massive body of work where you need a vastly expanded workforce and some really significantly different ways of working. We also know that the waiting lists that the government is talking about here are really elective waiting lists. So that's 7.3 million people waiting for a routine procedure, test or operation. What we do know, of course, is that beyond that, there are people waiting for mental health services, and we know that access times for mental health care absolutely gone through the roof. Levels of activity across mental health absolutely spiralling, and the number of people demand has significantly gone up. So we know that it isn't actually just about people waiting for hips, knees, other procedures, cataracts, etc. I think that the opposition, and I say this from an entirely non-party political perspective, the opposition has gone for a kind of bigger framed mission, build an NHS fit for the future, we absolutely know that workforce has to sit in the middle of that. And workforce should be, I hope, a key general election issue. But I think we do know that the money, we've got Jeremy Hunt here on the left-hand side, Chancellor moved to the Treasury last autumn, has played, I think, quite an important role in bringing some of the finances back into check. But there are some significant holes in the budget at the moment and some significant lack of progress, particularly around the long-term workforce plan. And the other big backdrop on this political stage is really the industrial action, which we've seen since December. We knew last summer, I think, that industrial action was coming, but we are seeing, to some extent, an intensification of that industrial action, despite some of the settlements that have been achieved, because we know we've got junior doctors not yet settled, we've got consultants going out to ballot, we've still got some of the Agenda for Change unions really in that place of focusing on industrial action. And I just want to move us on to think about all of those things coming together and the kind of perfect storm that these create. So we've got this cycle really at the moment, which is this massively and unprecedented, unparalleled operational pressure. And in a moment, I will just look at some of those elements of the operational pressure. We know part of that is to do with COVID, but part of it actually predates COVID. We've got massively constrained finances, and that has worsened significantly since last autumn, and the big challenges we saw with the pound tumbling, and also with cost of living pressures and massively constrained public finances. We've got this big lack of national workforce planning, and these three factors, the pressure, the finances, and the workforce planning, have led to industrial action. So we can't just solve one of them, we have to solve all three of them to build the workforce that we need to deliver the long-term plan. So I just want to talk a little bit about those pressures, because I think it's really important for us to remember what they look like and how they have been rising over the past, well, we saw some interesting patterns during COVID, but if we think about that broadly, kind of, it's hard to say post-COVID because we know it's still out there, but in the sort of since the beginning of 2022, how we have seen some really significant challenges in terms of pressures and performance, particularly over this winter where we had, horrible word, twindemic, but it does give voice to the pressures that people are facing in the health sector and in population as a whole, which is COVID-19 and flu together, which is a scenario that no one really wanted to face, but it was there. So massively high demand, big challenges on patient flow. Underpinning that, massive workforce challenges, vacancies. Vacancies have gone through the roof over the past 4 to 5 years. And I think if we look at this chart, the reddy pink chart, depending on how you see colour, the number of patients spending more than 12 hours from decision to admit to admission has really skyrocketed, and that isn't the kind of performance that any trust wants to see if we're thinking about an acute trust. And it really speaks to the challenges on patient flow, all of which speak to the need for greater investment across all parts of health and care, but also greater investment in the workforce. I just want to talk a bit now about these kind of 5 fault lines that exist and how they have cast a long shadow. Because I think that really what we need to remember is that actually these fault lines pre-exist COVID. So we talk a lot about COVID as being the kind of catalyst for lots of the challenges and problems we face. COVID was simply an exacerbator of existing challenges. So financially, we'd seen the NHS endure the longest and deepest funding squeeze in its history. Capacity has waned, mismatched to meet demand. We know that demand is way higher than it's ever been it's grown over the last 5 to 10 years, but there isn't the capacity to support that, and that means services, that means people critically. We know that social care has been a key element, and Ed touched on this, but social care is an absolutely critical element in managing patient flow and really getting ahead of demand. We've got a system which is focused on treatment rather than wellness. And again, I think some of what I've been saying resonates with what Ed said in terms of looking at the whole health system. And whilst health inequalities really came to the fore, both amongst patients and critically amongst the workforce during COVID, we know that health inequalities has been an enduring issue. COVID exacerbated it. COVID thankfully brought it in front of everyone's eyes and said, this is something we need to tackle. And we've got massive workforce gaps, and this is predominantly due to long-term failures in planning. We haven't planned for a very significant period of time. If you wind back 7 or 8 years, the Centre for Workforce Intelligence was disbanded. That gave us all of the data and information we needed. We don't have a single version of the truth anymore, and that's what we desperately need to deliver the long-term plan. If we're going to deliver a long-term plan, we need a long-term plan for workforce. And alongside this, and I think this is really important, alongside that, these fault lines which we have to tackle have started to bring the need for NHS reform up the agenda. And that's, I think, I'm going to say this is going to sound protectionist about the NHS, and I don't mean it to, but I think that when you have calls for reform alongside a general election, it's a particularly dangerous moment for that to happen, because people want to make bold statements. So I think that when we think about growing calls for reform, sorry, can I just get some water? I didn't. When we talk about growing calls for reform, I think it's a really difficult time for us to be discussing this, but we know it needs to be discussed at some point. Thank you so much. Sorry not to prepare myself. So we know that there is this massive concern over performance and sustainability of the NHS. Whilst the NHS has been the biggest recipient of funding increases if you compare it against other government departments. And I think that's a really important factor to remember. If you talk to local government, they will rightly say, if you're coming from an NHS perspective, well, hold on a moment, you're seeing rises like this, our budget has been cut like this. There's a massive mismatch there. We've got an important job to do. So the NHS has received significant funding increases compared to other public service, other big spending departments. However, that doesn't necessarily make it enough. But it speaks to this narrative then of NHS as this kind of money pit. You know, the more you pour in, the more it takes. It's a bottomless pit. You know, we're never going to get out of this. And I think there is also this bigger issue forming around, you know, the conversations around the clarity of the NHS offer versus the need to tackle all of these challenges that the whole population faces. If we don't improve whole population health, then we're not going to get a health service that is fit for purpose, because a significant proportion of the problem lies in not preventing ill health. And I think, you know, you see that last point at the bottom of the slide, the ongoing cuts to funding for wider determinants of health and prevention have been one of the most significant failures, I think, over the last 10 years in terms of trying to get ahead of the curve and trying to make this manageable NHS service where the workforce feels like they've got a doable task, patients are receiving what they need to receive, and the population overall is healthier. I mean, I think it's quite shocking that for the first time we have seen a slowing in the kind of average lifespan of individuals in the country, and also a massive widening of the gap between those who are living longest in terms of, affluence and those whose lives are significantly constrained in terms of deprivation. All of these factors are really focusing that pressure for NHS reform. But I think what I would say is, without being protectionist, we need to think about when is there a clear stretch of time where the NHS, public services and the country as a whole can have a conversation about reforming the NHS. If we flip now to the workforce, the evidence shows us that there are significant pressures on staff. So 23% in the staff survey saying that staff never or rarely experience unrealistic time pressures. And I think it's astonishing that it's 23%. I would have said probably it feels, when you talk to people, it feels like that's probably 10 or 15%, but 23% in the staff survey report never or rarely experiencing unrealistic time pressures. Workforce race equality standard, we know this issue. Ethnic minority staff much more likely to be formally disciplined. This is a very, very big issue and challenge, and we need to tackle all of the issues around equality, diversity, inclusion, discrimination across the NHS. It's one of the key tenets of a good and supportive approach to workforce, and I don't think we have that yet. We know the disparities that are out there. GMC data shows it to us, NMC data shows it to us, and I think that's something where the whole NHS needs to come together to support the workforce, particularly if we're going to have a workforce that is fit for the next 5, 10, 15 years. We're waiting to receive the data for workforce disability standard. Is another area where we need to look and see how do we, given we've got 124,000 vacancies across the NHS, how are we going to support everyone to both continue to work in the NHS, no matter what they come to work with, but also how are we going to attract people to the NHS when it's becoming a much less popular destination for people than it used to be. And then I think this very, very telling statistic here, which is stress, anxiety and depression causing over 500,000 lost days. There are some solutions to some of this. One of them is about collaboration, and we are seeing the development of ICSs, which Ed rightly talked about it and focused on, because it is very, very important. Collaboration, partnership working, integration will start to bring all different parts of the service together, across public services together, to deliver solutions, including shared workforces, which I think will be critical. And of course, we need that long-term workforce plan. That's how we fill the vacancies. That's how we make sure that staff feel like they've got a realistic job that they can actually get their arms around and deliver. And I think that without that, we don't go any way to creating a workforce that is fit to deliver the aspirations of the long-term plan. So, what do we want to see in this long-term plan? We absolutely need to see fully funded, fully costed and fully funded plans that take us for every section of the workforce through the next 10 years at least. We need to make sure that we've got a workforce where everybody feels valued, they feel they belong, there's an environment in which they can thrive. And staff well-being, I think, is fundamental to that. Pay is a critical issue. Pay doesn't stand alone, but it is a key factor. And without adequate pay, we won't get where we need to be. And we know that the cost of living challenges have started to show us that right now, pay isn't adequate. We need to set a level of pay that is sustainable, but also works for the staff who are living, some of them in very, very difficult circumstances. And alongside that, pension reform is a priority. And this isn't just pension reform for those at the top. We need to see that. Pension shouldn't be punitive. Pension shouldn't be something where people feel that, they're frightened to open the brown envelope that comes through the door in case they've got a massive tax bill. pension reform is also about how we create that equity across the whole of the NHS workforce, so people feel able to pay into a pension scheme and feel able to take advantage of what's there. And then finally, if we think about the whole offer that is available to the NHS workforce, the kind of total package, training has to be that key element that many people would say, you know, I could go and do X, Y, or Z job, but I wouldn't get that training that I get across the NHS. I wouldn't be developed in the way. We know that the pressures on the workforce at the moment mean that time for training isn't always protected. So we've got to make sure that we have that kind of investment in career progression and the protected time for training. So my closing thoughts from today are that politics is key. You know, whatever we think about the NHS and however much we want to think we can run a service without politics, it's there and it's fundamental, and we do need to remember that. And it's, you know, how the NHS develops is all about that interaction between the strategic elements of the NHS and the political will of the party of government, and in the run-up to an election, the opposition as well. But I think this sustained sense of flux, febrility, is leaving its mark on an NHS that has become subject to increasingly short-term decision-making. And we know that, you know, if you talk to NHS England, they are desperate to be able to get to grips with a long-term plan, but are in a situation where they just can't do that at the moment. Pressure. We know that the workforce is bearing the brunt of the impact of key external factors, rising demand, cost of living, all of those challenges. There is evidence that shows that deprivation actually translates into massive rise in demand, not just for acute services, but for mental health and community services as well, and puts a massive burden on ambulance services. So that pressure that exists is playing out for every single member of the NHS workforce. And then finally, on performance, how do we get ahead of that performance challenge without a long-term workforce plan to deliver the aspirations of the long-term plan? I'll stop there.
Thank you.